Some of the content presented here deals with potentially disturbing topics such as adult rape and sex trafficking, childhood sexual assault, and trafficking and child rape. Unfortunately, exploring solutions to these terrible problems necessitates them to be studied and discussed. Please proceed with caution, especially if you are a victim or a survivor. What's up, guys, and welcome back to the Trafficking Free America podcast. In today's episode, we talk about fighting the demand to ultimately end sex trafficking. Joining us today is Allan as he discusses his many theories and topics on the research he has done that actually went into a recent book he wrote, which we're going to discuss as well. But also what we're discussing in this particular episode is how fighting the demand can ultimately help end sex trafficking in America. And then we'll get into the details as to how we see that occurring. Allan, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this assignment. I do, because you know a little bit about my story.
Of course.
And ever since I gave my life to the Lord, especially getting baptized and leaving all my old stuff, as they say, in the river. Mm-hmm. The Lord's been whispering to me the answers to that question for this podcast for essentially 8 years. Mm-hmm. And it was just in the last couple of weeks, in fact, right after I learned I would have the opportunity to do this, that the final pieces were given to me and the whole picture came into focus. And I'm just very humbled and excited to share with you what I have.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked many times in the organization and the podcast how ultimately you can't really end sex trafficking without fighting the demand, which is where it's all fueled from. So, but what we're going to discuss with you today is you're kind of helping our audience kind of understand a little bit of the triangle, if you would, of sex trafficking, how it occurs in our country, specifically around our country in America, as there's probably many facets, but I would say related in many ways around the world. But yeah, so go ahead.
We'll walk through this. About 5 years ago, I came up with, and not just me, it was based on a lot of research, but I came up with a new triangle and a new model for how we approach sex trafficking, not just here in America, but in the world. And, that's just been by itself on our website and in my book. I don't think many people have seen it. But I'm looking at the current model that we have. So just to walk people through time, traditionally, it was the women that participated in adultery or prostitution. They got punished when they were found out. And we handled it that way from the beginning of time through the Bible times all the way up to the turn of the millennia.
Yeah.
In 1999, out of Europe, came the Nordic model, specifically from Sweden. And their initiative was to recognize that the women that were caught up in all of this were victims and that they should get rehabilitation in place of punishments. So this was embraced in Europe right away. Punishments are still there, but they all go to the men or the buyers.
Sure.
This approach spread to America pretty quickly, between 2007 2015-ish. It was adopted here. And this is the model that we have today. So imagine a triangle. We call it the sex trafficking triangle. And this is our current model, the Nordic model. And at its base, at its foundation, is the supply or the victims. So all of our focus is there.
Yeah, a lot of it. Definitely.
Well, a lot. And it needs to be in a way because the rehabilitative work that we're doing with women that have been abused is essential.
Yeah.
And I will say right here that while the approach I'm going to discuss today does involve some radical change, I am not advocating that any of the resources that are going to victims be diminished.
Yeah.
And none of the money would get pulled, not one
Yeah.
penny.
Yeah.
That is not what I'm saying.
Correct. Yeah.
We do need a new approach,
Mm-hmm.
and new resources and new money have to come with that.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure that's clear. So the assumed cause of the Nordic model is that the buyers do so out of ignorance or indifference.
Mm-hmm.
There are legal consequences for buyers and no longer for the victims. And there are rehabilitative services for the victims.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the result of this approach is good because the sex market is temporarily diminished because of those sanctions on the buyers. But it leaves supply and distribution intact.
Mm-hmm.
And I've made the point in other podcasts that if the behavior of the buyer is motivated by something other than ignorance, like sex addiction, even though sanctions are there, or even if they get high, because of the addiction, they're likely going to step back into it.
Yeah.
So it's a temporary disruption
Yeah.
in the market. Newsflash, there's more than one triangle.
Mm-hmm.
To really understand sex trafficking, we really need to look at all of the interactions of unwanted sexual behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine that sex trafficking triangle is now in the upper right of a universe that has two other triangles.
Yeah.
The triangle beside it to the left is what we call the sex addiction triangle.
Mm-hmm.
At its foundation is pornography consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? When someone depends or develops a dependency on watching pornography, their brain really changes almost immediately. There are studies that say within 4 hours they can detect morphing through brain scans.
Mm-hmm.
And once that starts to happen, it becomes very difficult to stop on your own, which is what most people try to do unsuccessfully. So when this starts and they're in that dependency phase, they're watching pornography, there can be other behaviors like AI or the visual reality, virtual reality is, popular today. In the past, it was 1-900 numbers. It was just like talking to a person. Mm-hmm. But what these all have in common is they're not in immediate contact in the same room with another human being.
Right.
So we call all those behaviors synthetic.
It's like the loophole of prostitution, if you would.
Yeah. We've done a previous podcast where I point out how that really is a form of buying sex, and it is.
Absolutely.
But it's at arm's length, right?
Yeah.
Chat rooms, OnlyFans, all that stuff, it's at arm's length. There's a screen in between.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, those behaviors will manifest a deep sex addiction, and over time, typically, someone's behavior will spill out into the real world.
Yeah.
And that could be casual with affairs. It could be transactional with buying sex. And depending on other issues they may have, it could even be violent with, for example, adult rape.
Correct. And just to set the record straight, the reason why, we think about pornography or calling online, if you would, or even it all ultimately generates the ability of like, oh, look, OnlyFans. Let me talk about that one. And it generates this, I can get a lot of business from this. So then people are recruited to do it. So
I'm so glad you say that.
Sold as consensual, commercial sex.
Yeah.
And it all it does is drive non-consensual commercial sex. I don't think any commercial sex is consensual.
Not by all parties, no.
But ultimately, that's what it's driving. And then, like you said, then it drives those buyers to ultimately become those perpetrators.
Right.
And then the world wonders, how do we get perpetrators?
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. We produce them.
Yeah.
That's why. So foundational to these two triangles is a third triangle.
Yeah.
So I have it at the base, like it's supporting the other two. And I call that the trauma triangle. Mm-hmm. At the foundation of the trauma triangle is disruptions in childhood development. Mm-hmm. Now, there's several of these. There are adverse childhood experiences. They're sometimes referred to as ACEs. Mm-hmm. And this relates to a really big study that was done over 30 years longitudinally by our government, the Center for Disease Control. Mm-hmm. And it was very illuminating. So they have, at that time, when they did it the first time, there were just 10 questions they asked adults about their childhood. Mm-hmm. It's been modified over the years. I think there's 14 or 15 questions now because some people with bad feelings were like, how come I was left out? And so they expanded the list. But just imagine things like, did you have a parent who got arrested? Did you have a parent who attempted suicide? Mm-hmm. Did you suffer molestation as a child? Did your parents get divorced? Did you witness somebody physically assaulting your mother? Et cetera, et cetera. So they have 10 of these. And so people would take the survey. They used really members to the healthcare system, Kaiser Permanente, which had just hundreds of thousands of people with records and stuff. And they were able to research those medical records. This was before HIPAA, I guess. And they were able to distill all this information. So what they learned, and I learned it when I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Besser Vanderholt. Now, Dr. Vanderholt, or Kolk, did not participate in the study, but he's an expert on the study, and he wrote a book about it. Mm-hmm. My goodness. So they've concluded that not only, essentially, that the trauma, if somebody has, like, say, 4 or more of those terrible questions checked as part of their life experience, their vulnerability to contracting physical medical problems, like heart disease or cancer, for example, goes up considerably. They make 2 just earth-shattering conclusions. I remember when I read it, they said that our mental institutions, our hospitals, and our prisons are full of adults that have too many of these ACE scores. Mm-hmm. And they even went on to say, they concluded that the most expensive disease that we have to fight is not cancer or heart disease. It's these adverse experiences in the lives of our children, because they proved that carrying that stress your whole life is what causes the disease.
Interesting.
Very interesting. So those are ACEs. Among the ACEs is child sexual assault. Now, we have the trigger warning. I'm going to get into some things now and on the next slide that can be very uncomfortable. But we have to talk about them because of how they relate to trafficking. Mm-hmm. So child sexual assault is a lot of things. I mean, it could be lower level, like grooming someone under 18, exposing someone under 18 to explicit pornography, touching them, molestation, and then it gets darker, like non-penetrative rape and even penetrative rape of a child. Very similar to that is child sexual exploitation, which is really all the same stuff, but for commercial gain, like if you traffic somebody under 18. And instead of having 1 or 2 occurrences like this in their life, it's every day, all day.
Right.
Okay. Solution that I want to propose to how we treat trafficking, just that trafficking triangle.
Okay.
So it's interesting. This came to me like 5 years ago. Like I woke up in the middle of the night and this whole thing just spilled out of me. I don't know where it came from. And I called it the Teixeira model. And then the next day I was like, what are you thinking? That's so vain. So I called it like the Tampa Bay model. And then I prayed about that, and God said, don't offend me. It's bigger than that. So I named it like the Florida model. And then just this week when I was putting this together, national nonprofit, I thought, well, how about the American model? That matches up well with the Nordic or the European, right? So
sure.
Let's go up against those guys.
So the
American
model.
So this triangle sits differently. We have demand, or the buyers, at the base, which makes sense because this will not go away until men stop buying sex. So they're the cause, and so if they're the root cause, we really should be focusing on them too.
So the difference between your model and the previous model we began with is that the base of the previous model was the supply.
Correct.
And which is, when you say base, you're saying like it all comes from that. It all comes from
right,
and where most of our focus is right now.
Right.
And you're saying, I believe we need to go after the demand as
right.
the primary.
Yeah, because there's no causal link in that Nordic model to the supply. Okay, victims do play a role. We'll get into that in a little bit later, but they're not the cause. They're not.
No,
it's men who are buying them and who are willing to buy. Any illicit market is demand driven. This one's no different.
Effect.
Yeah, they're affected, but they don't cause it. So now we're attacking root cause with buyers and demand at the base. So if we approach the problem of sex trafficking in America this way, we're saying the assumed cause is unresolved trauma that leads to sex addiction in the lives of sex buyers. There are legal consequences, just like the Nordic model. The demand side has to bear the brunt of those sanctions, and there are none for supply. In that respect, there's no change between the two models. However, in the category of rehabilitative services, both supply and demand, including their family members, get those resources now. So that's a change. And the result of approaching it this way is that the sex market is permanently diminished with demand reduction, and supply and distribution reduce proportionately to how good of a job we do with demand reduction. So the triangle will shrink now by focusing on the demand.
So would you say that if you think about the current model, where I was to say the first model we're talking about, not the new one we're discussing, but where the supply is at the base, what we're kind of doing is saying like, okay, the supply is the base. We need to help these victims. We need to be angry at the distributors and arrest them, and then the demand. What do you think is the current focus on? If you're thinking about the way we mentally
right.
Look at it,
So
like, all right,
I'm not
kill the get the trafficker, help the victim, and then the demand is what?
Well, you have to get the demand too. They're responsible.
Right, but what are they thinking right now? In your belief of how they're approaching it?
I think the Nordic model is correct, but I think it's only half right.
What do you mean by that?
Because they have the demand being punished and recognizing victims as just that, as being victims, and that they need rehabilitation.
Sure.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
But it's not 100% right, because the piece they miss is that they need rehabilitation for the men that are doing this too.
Yeah.
That's the piece they miss.
Right.
And I would call the focus on the supply side or the victims is a reaction. Okay, that's a reaction. It's treating a symptom. But we need to treat the disease and cure it instead of just treating symptoms. And to do that, we have to work with the men.
By focusing on the demand, you're creating a bad business that people don't want to get into. That reduces the traffickers, which ultimately reduces the supply.
Yeah, that whole triangle will shrink
Yeah.
to the degree that you can get men to stop buying sex.
Right.
Yeah.
So how are we going to do that?
With a sex addiction recovery group or a sex addiction therapy group, there are lots of these. At the Sexual Integrity Project, we follow a model that was put into place by Pure Desire Ministries. So let me talk just a little bit about that. And before I do, I want to point out how necessary a recovery group like this is to the problem.
Yeah.
A recovery group differs from a therapy group. Okay, a therapy group is run by a professional, and that's probably the best place you could be. But there just are not enough therapists in this space to address the problem. So we have, and it depends on if you include those synthetic parts of the sex addiction triangle of people that are consuming pornography, for example, in the sex addiction numbers, there's arguments back and forth on that. But depending on how you treat that population, there's 20 to 30 million sex addicts in America. There are 2,000, maybe 2,500 therapists qualified to work in this space. So that's 8 to 15,000 clients per therapist, which is overwhelming. There are not enough therapists to deal with this one-on-one.
Yeah.
We need a group therapy approach, and we need lay leaders to take the mantle with that. Ideally, somebody with lived experience who's overcome sex addiction and understands and gets it, that's got the right kind of aptitudes, charisma, and leadership qualities to run a group effectively. If we approach it like that, then we have a chance because, and I've said this before, there are situations where a particular trauma that somebody has in a group setting is really beyond the scope of that group, and they do need professional help. But the group is able to refer a good therapist that they know is well suited to deal with that. And when the client comes, they don't spend 6 months on the couch talking about their mom. They did all that in group with the workbooks. They're highly focused. They know the exact issue. They've worked through most of it, and they just need to be sort of have the ball pushed into the end zone by the therapist, right? So they usually get very good results in just a few sessions, and they're done. That's what we need. I've made the analogy, these rich eye doctors that do the radial keratotomy and they make $4 million a year. They do that because they have receptionists that do all the intake and the paperwork. They have nurses that prep. They have nurses that assist. And they literally have a conveyor belt. And all they do is the part that they're expert. And they do it over and over and over and make a ton of money. Therapists in this space have to be put in a position like that because there's so few of them.
Right.
And that's what this recovery group model does. So it's very necessary. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between a sobriety group like Alcoholics Anonymous or Celebrate Recovery and what we're calling a recovery group. There's a different mindset. So in a sobriety group, typically the person who attends really feels like the group owns the problem, and if group doesn't go well, then their recovery's not going to go well. And so that's the barometer for their success, is how group goes or how good the leader is. And, their goal is sobriety, just white knuckle it and stop doing this one bad thing.
Yeah.
In a recovery group, it's different. There's an all-in commitment. There's ownership. They own the problem. They report to the group leader. They take responsibility for their own healing. And it's process-based. What did I do this week to either support or detract from my recovery? It's about learning how to do life better, replacing negative behaviors with positive ones. And it's holistic. The time in group is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's all the connection and intentional weekly self-help work they do in the workbook. That's the other thing. They have a workbook. The sobriety groups don't do that. So they're doing homework, they're reading and answering very difficult and provocative questions that were written by sex addiction recovery doctors. It's all well designed to help them unpack their trauma and resolve it. So when you combine that with a faith walk and with community and that experience of being completely honest and experiencing acceptance for the first time, and a little bit of grace and no judgment, then the healing can start and it can take off. So that's the environment we create with a recovery group. Incidentally, just to tie it back into trafficking, we've taken guys that have come through a recovery group program like this. We have data on 14 of them that were sex buyers in the past. And we asked them in a survey at the moment they really show that they have at least achieved sobriety, a bunch of questions like when they were born, what year this activity started, both the synthetic stuff with pornography and in the real world sex buying. When did it stop? So we can measure how many years that activity was going on. What was the frequency? So we can calculate like the total number of hours of watching pornography, the total number of sex purchases they made, how much money they spent. So we know what the average cost was, how much they contributed to the sex market. And then how much they spent on therapy and recovery workbooks, and how many hours they spent in the group, and individual therapy, all that stuff, the time and the money.
Yeah.
From those metrics, we can calculate things like the years of their direct activity buying, the years of watching pornography, as well as how much pornography consumption was erased by giving them this course correction of health where they stop their behavior. Same thing, like how many sex purchases were displaced as a result of them overcoming the addiction.
This is just based off.
This is off 14 men.
Yeah.
So you get the idea. We can calculate from those numbers how much money we've pulled out of the market, how many years of freedom we gave, or person years of freedom we gave to a trafficked individual, and how many years of trafficking that we erased.
Yeah.
From ever happening. I'm not talking about putting a trafficker in jail and a different trafficker runs his corner and book a business. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying it never happened.
Right.
And that's what we need. We need to shrink the triangle. And so this is a proof of concept that this works. And those 14 men have erased over 135,000 hours of watching explicit pornography online, which is like a continuous stream. I don't remember. It was something like 55 years.
Right.
to watch all of that. And it's not happened. They've pulled over $2.5 million out of the sex market. They've erased over 18,000 sex purchases, which is roughly the equivalent of 5 person years of freedom for a trafficked individual, or putting a trafficker out of business. Like, it never happened.
Yeah.
Of a year of that activity never happened. So, we're proud about that. And I just wanted to show
if we
you.
could just do that across the country.
Well, that's why we're here. We need to duplicate that little micro study that the Sexual Integrity Project has done.
Yeah.
And multiply it by thousands. That's what we need to do. So let's go back to trauma. Let's talk about the child sexual assaults again. I know it's a dark topic, but most intelligent people think that an adult that perpetrates child sexual assault was a victim when they were a kid. And that's a widely held belief, and it's true and it's not true. It's not the strongest indicator that an adult would perpetrate CSA.
Sorry, can you repeat that? You're saying that the perpetrator is a victim?
Typically, is what most people think. That it's
think.
Cyclical. And it is cyclical.
Sure.
And I will say we need a lot more research in this space. There's not enough. Because the little we have...
Explain victim of what? What do you mean?
Child sexual assault.
So like the person that...
So when they were under 18,
assault,
they received that trauma,
yeah,
and then they end up growing into an adult, and they duplicate that.
And that's what you mean by victim in that situation.
Yeah. So, right. But the data doesn't back that up completely. So I just want to talk about it. We need more. We need more money and more research in this space so we can understand it better. The little bit of studies that are out there, they don't agree well. Like I don't think you could say that there's a consensus, because there's a lot of conflicting results.
Yeah, it's hard to get data unless you get honesty.
Right, and that's another problem when we deal with these subjects. You have the problem of underreporting, and you have the problem of lying. Yeah. So anyway, we'll just set those on the sidelines. So only about 1 in 3 victims of child sexual assault go on to perpetrate child sexual assault. Mm-hmm. But if you study the adults that do perpetrate child sexual assault, 2/3 of them suffered it as a child. So it's not lining up 1-to-1. And it's not every person who suffered CSA as a child grows up to perpetrate it. So 2/3 of the people who suffer that as a child, they never do it.
They never do it to somebody else.
They never do it to somebody else.
Based on the data that we do know.
Right. That just goes to the grave with them. They never turn around and perpetrate. And that makes sense because, it's a horrible thing. And if someone has the right constitution, they're like, I'm never visiting that on another human being. I don't care what it takes. I'm not doing that.
Yeah. Doesn't mean that they're not dealing with other trauma,
Of course not.
but
Right.
you're just saying that
So
specific thing doesn't cause that.
it
Specific.
turns out that the strongest indicator that an adult would perpetrate child sexual assault is a mixture that, yes, they did suffer it as a child, but combined with these other ACE score questions, a multitude of them.
Okay.
So a high ACE person, and these are the non-sex assault ACEs, combined with the sexual assault ACE. Okay, so that turns out to be the strongest indicator. And curiously, if 2/3 of the adults who perpetrate CSA suffered it, where's this other third coming from?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the answer is we really don't know because we haven't studied it well enough. I suspect it's a mixture of people with high ACE scores that didn't suffer anything sexual and probably some strong mental disease people, you know, in there. But I don't know for sure. The reason I bring all this up, and I know it's painful to talk about, is because it plays in very heavily to the sex trafficking triangle. I would like to get a little more deeper into the ACE study. I gave a sort of a 30,000-foot overview when I introduced it. But this was done in 1998, and the definition of adverse childhood experiences is they are potentially traumatic events that can have negative, lasting effects on health and well-being. These experiences range from physical, emotional, or sexual abuse to parental divorce or the incarceration of a parent or a guardian. So I skimmed by these before. Let's see if I can just throw out a few others. Oh, did a household member go to prison? Did a household member have mental illness or attempt suicide? The intimate partner violence. Do you feel like you were ever treated unfairly because of race or ethnicity? That's one of the newer ones. It's not part of the original 10. Did you feel unsafe in your neighborhood? That's a new one, not part of the original 10. Were you bullied by a peer or a classmate? Did you ever go through foster care? So those are a few of the other ones. This was that, I said they pulled the data from Kaiser Permanente members. They asked 13,500 people to fill out the survey, and they got 10,000 responses. So the statistical significance on this is about as high as you can get. So they grouped all those bad things on the list into 7 categories, which was psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, substance abuse in a parent, mental illness in a parent, witnessing intimate partner violence, specifically towards the mother, and criminal behavior or incarceration of a parent or family member. So the things they tracked longitudinally were heart disease, cancer, stroke, bronchitis, chronic bronchitis, or COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, what they used to call hardening of the arteries. They're needing to get some angioplasty, that kind of stuff. Diabetes, hepatitis, and the number of skeletal fractures suffered. And what they discovered, and I pointed out in the aggregate how groundbreaking this was, but they people with a high ACE score, which they define as having 4 or more, have a 4 to 12 times increase in the likelihood of alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, or suicide attempts. They have a 2 to 4 times increase in smoking, poor self-regulated health, having more than 50 sexual intimate partners, or contracting a sexually transmitted infection. They are 1.4 to 1.6 times more likely to have the habit of physical inactivity or severe obesity. And it's because they carry all this unresolved stress. It just kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
So they tracked for the population who has 0 ACEs. So those people had a very easy time of it. And then they graphed it out. What if you have 1 ACE, 2, 3, or 4 or more against all these different maladies? And every graph looks the same. They all go up at like a 30-degree angle, whether they're looking at alcoholism, liver disease, depression, the prescription rates for antidepressants, suicide attempts, being raped later in life, being a perpetrator of intimate partner violence, being promiscuous sexually as a teen, smoking as an adult, COPD, and having impaired work-life performances. So folks with 4 or more tend to go to prison, not finish school. They either drop out or just can't graduate. They get divorced. They get fired a lot from their jobs. You get the idea.
Yeah.
In terms of how it breaks out, percentage-wise in the population, the folks who have a 0, which everybody would want to be one of them, that's like 37% in the population. The people who have 1 and only 1 are about 26% of the population. And the folks with 2 are 16, the folks with 3 are 9, and the population that has 4 or more is 12%. That's 1 in 8 people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
12% of our
the
population.
Yeah, about 1 in 8 adults has 4 or more of these.
Based on the data that we know.
I'm a 7. I know a man in Houston. He's a doctor who's an 8. There's a woman here locally that works for one of our partnering nonprofits. She went to one of our events last year. She's a 9. And I have a young man in my prison group who is a 14.
So what we're seeing is trauma that has not been dealt with, which causes stressors that we do not know how to overcome, is what often leads to bad addictions, bad practices, unhealthy lifestyles. That's what we're looking at right now as we think about addressing the demand.
Yes.
Is helping with
right.
those parts on the preventative side of things.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that the task that lies before us, if we want to be really effective reducing sex trafficking, is not just attacking demand, but we have to attack trauma. We have to attack the number of these traumatic events that young people are suffering somehow, some way. And I'm going to get into how we can do that. Let's talk just a little bit about the sex addiction triangle. We spent a lot of time on the sex trafficking triangle. We spent a lot of time on the trauma triangle. So what I'd like people to understand is, like, where is sex addiction coming from? I'm starting to hear more and more about it. And, you know, oh my goodness, 30 million Americans. Are you kidding me? That's like 1 in 10 adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also the problem is we're trying to figure out what is considered sexual addiction. And
You're right.
not, you know, like on certain extremes and stuff.
Right. Yeah. So this begins now in our age of technology very young. Very young. Sometimes as early as 2 years old. And I'm not saying 2-year-olds are watching porn. I'm not saying that. But what they are doing is they have a tablet, right? And they're playing games on that. And they're starting to get dopamine delivered to their brain at rates that, you know, God never really intended. And so they're being saturated in that, and they're developing that dopamine dependency and even a dopamine addiction very young. As they get older, there's social media. School now is all on like different apps and computers and tech, and it's just a lot of screen time.
The world we live in is very fast moving.
Yes,
and causes that very young and stuff. Yeah.
The other thing that's happening, coming at them the other direction, is their first explicit pornography exposure. That used to be in the mid-teens. When I went through recovery, it was like 13 for boys, 12 for boys, 13 for girls. Now I've seen some studies that say it's 8 years old for boys and 9 for girls now. I have a daughter who's going to be 13 soon, and she says she's never seen it, but her friends at school are all talking about it. She's in 7th grade.
Yeah.
And yes, I have open conversations about all these topics with her. And it's refreshing to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I guess the message I'm saying is that it's an unintended consequence. You know, Steve Jobs did not intend for this to happen when he introduced the smartphone in 2007.
Yeah.
But we all put every hour of pornography that exists, that ever has existed, and that ever will exist in the pockets of our children, unregulated, 24/7, 365, with no supervision. That's what we did. Nobody planned that, but it happened, and it is having vast negative consequences. For example, the women who are about 23 years old right now. It's 2026. So women born in about 99. They've had this their whole life. By the time they were old enough to get a phone, it was a smartphone.
Yeah.
And so they've done this, and they are dopamine addicted. They've been immersed in all this tech, and they're much more visually attuned than their mothers or their grandmothers ever were.
Mm-hmm.
And that is making them, I believe, more vulnerable to pornography. And I think it explains the vast jump we've seen in pornography consumption among young women.
Mm-hmm.
So the Barna Group studies this, and they came out with a report in 2024 that had 2023 data in it, and it showed that the year before, in 2022, just talking about young adults, 18 to 24, 3 in 4 men were consuming in 22, and 1 in 3 women. A year later, in 23, the men jumped to 4 out of 5, and the women jumped to 3 out of 4. They more than doubled in 1 year, and nobody knows why. And I think it's this age of tech that they grew up, 100% of their childhood was in it is the reason. That's what I think, but I can't prove it. If I'm right about that, we've got a lot of problems, because what that means is over the next 8 to 15 years, as those women get married and then lose those marriages, just like a man would, we're going to have a big problem.
Sure.
If you consume pornography, you're 4 times as likely to cheat, and you're 3 times as likely to get divorced. And I see that there could be a tsunami wave of divorces that include male betrayal trauma coming. And
which is divorce in itself is just one of the questions that we saw.
Yeah, it is. And,
right?
When this happens in the sex addiction triangle, the kids are affected. They get traumatized. And so now they have ACEs, and they're down and back at the bottom. And this is the big slide. This is the one that it took 8 years for me to really figure out. So there's a few things that are different from the first time I showed this graph. The first thing I will show you is that in the upper right, the sex trafficking triangle features the American model. So we have demand at the base.
At the core, yeah.
I didn't talk about it on the first one, but you might have been wondering, what are all those red arrows? What does that mean in the center? And what those indicate is that each of these 3 triangles influences and is influenced by the other 2 triangles.
Yeah.
And there is a feedback loop. Okay, so on the first version of this slide, that feedback loop was a negative one. The whole universe of the 3 triangles was growing bigger, and you might remember they were bigger on that first slide. They were as big as we could make them. So that negative feedback loop is making it grow, because traumatized people in the trauma triangle, and there's a lot. If you look at the data, 1 in 4 girls experience CSA of some type before the age of 18. I've seen studies that say 1 in 6 boys. I've seen studies that say as few as 1 in 20 boys. So that needs to be studied better, because it's all over the map. But essentially, if you add all that up, and the people with high ACEs, and some of those populations intersect, but what it basically says is 1 in 4 adults are dealing with some significant trauma when you put them both together. And because of underreporting, I believe the real number is probably closer to 1 in 3. And that's a lot of people. There's a huge cloud of vulnerable, traumatized people that surround these other 2 triangles. And they could go a lot of places. They could come in through pornography to the sex addiction triangle because of that vulnerability. They might find that viewing pornography helps them self-medicate that trauma. And the process we described of dependency and addiction, and then becoming out of the triangle on that transactional side and coming in as a buyer on the sex trafficking triangle, you can see how it's fueling. I can tell you from the research that I cite there is one thing that all three sides of the sex trafficking triangle have in common. It doesn't matter if you're a victim, if you're a buyer, if you're a distributor, they all have that trauma. So it's that traumatized population that's providing the people that get sucked into it.
Mm-hmm.
So here I'm introducing this concept of a recovery group where we give them community, we give them resources. Now, look, I think it came out in the podcast I did with you a couple years ago that I spent some time in prison. That wasn't directly because of anything sexual. It was just because of a tragedy where I was at fault. And it was less than a year. It was not a pleasant experience for me. About 4 years ago, when I was coming through recovery, I started getting these God winks that I was supposed to go into the prison system with this program. Like I didn't hear God talk, but you know how it goes. I had like 5 people in the span of a week just weirdly say, you should go to the prison system.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when that starts happening like over and over, it's a message. So I made arrangements. I got approved. I went through all the training, and I started in 2023 in January. By February, I was into my class about a month before I realized that my clients, these group members that I was ministering to, were child molesters. They were sex offenders. They were sex predators. I didn't even know. Like, I didn't study how the law worked at that time. That's pretty much what you have to be to go to prison in Florida, because buying an adult is only a misdemeanor in this state. And I hadn't put those things together. I didn't connect the dots. I was just like shocked this one day when I figured it out.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do. You know, I was like, my program is not even designed for this, I told myself. And you know, those people need highly specialized therapy. I'm not qualified. I'm wasting my time. Why am I here? And I prayed about it. And I decided just to stick it through to see what would happen. So the next week I pull up at the prison. I left my judgment in the parking lot, and I went in there, and I just loved on those guys, and I walked them through the program. Out of that class, there's like 4 that are out of prison, doing fantastic, leading groups of their own post-prison. They are secure in their jobs. They have healthy relationships. Some of them don't have a girlfriend. Some are dating. Some are engaged and going to get married. And what we're now beginning to see is that a trauma-informed recovery group type of program, obviously in this space it deals with sex addiction in a very clinically informed way, but this could be applied to other addicts or other traumatized populations. It brings them to a place where they resolve that trauma and are able to step into something a lot healthier. And they can have good marriages, and they can have healthy families, and they have the capacity to raise secure children. And that is a profound discovery, because it gives us a mechanism if we intersect at the base of this trauma triangle. Obviously, in the prison system, we know there's a lot of traumatized people, but inner cities, other places, other chemical addictions, it could be applied to all of that to bring folks to a place that they are not going to visit the same level of traumas they endured on the next generation. Because we have to create a way that the children of the future don't have to experience as many of these. If we do that, the supply, and when I say supply, I'm talking about a different supply, not the victims in the sex trafficking triangle. I'm talking about the supply of vulnerable people that can fall into any part of the top 2 triangles, like the pornography, trafficking.
The vulnerable population.
75% of traffickers were raped as children. 75%. And
I believe ultimately, you do traumatic things to
Yeah,
people,
but I was going to say,
they're like, they don't care about doing traumatic things.
when I read that, I was like, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because I've always asked myself, how could a human being treat another human being that way? Like, you have to have zero empathy.
Because they were treated that
I was
way,
like, how does that
probably
happen?
Or,
I kept reading. I'm like, well, childhood rape will do that. That's what happens.
Your proposal of fighting the demand, obviously, it's addressing many of the vulnerabilities that exist on the ACE program.
Yes,
it
does.
Many of those, like, let's go one by one and addressing this.
Yeah.
Like, a big focus of yours is to go into the prisons and help these men and women who are in there right now.
That happened like kind of by accident, as I explained.
Yeah.
Because I had been in prison. I didn't want to go back, but I was just being obedient.
Sure.
And what it taught me was that there's a wider application for this recovery group program than just going into a church and helping young men that are watching pornography to stop. Yeah. It's much more powerful than that, because it can help anybody overcome any unwanted sexual behavior, okay? It works for child molesters and pornography consumers. It works for sex buyers. It works for traffickers. It works. So we have to find a way to provide this to those people. That graph I was just looking at with the 3 triangles and the involvement of a recovery group, we can immediately, in a reactive sense, find people with unwanted behaviors that are watching pornography and becoming sex addicted, or full-blown addiction buying sex. We could have trauma-informed John schools. We know how to intersect with these populations, and we can put them through a program and get them into a recovery group model where they can spend the 2 to 5 years to completely stop that behavior by completely getting healthy, lifelong health, okay?
Yeah.
However, we also have the opportunity to address other traumatized populations that may not be acting out sexually, or maybe doing things that are not just pornography, like sex buying or this child abuse stuff. And we can get them to a place where they're not going to visit that on the next generation. And that's a big lift. That's like a 2-generation lift, because you might turn someone around, but they already have kids. They already hurt their kids. Their kids are going to demonstrate a lot of that stuff. Sure. But then you get the kids, and now the grandkids are going to be okay. So it's 20 to 50 years. But, if we don't start, we'll never finish. And I really think that we can turn that negative feedback loop I told you about with the 3 triangles. I mean, all 3 triangles each influence and are influenced by the other 3. That's still happening. But with the application of these recovery groups and trauma resolution programs, we can turn the tide and get that to work to our advantage, where the 3 triangles begin to shrink.
So ultimately, we've heard, to kind of wrap it up here, in attacking the demand, and when we meet, a lot of times it's attacking buyers. So people have looked at that as arresting many more. People have looked at that as helping overcome their want to buy sex in certain ways, like kind of scraping the surface in many ways. But it's kind of like how we've said, let's try to only worry about helping the victims. It's almost like squeegeeing a beach, So now, then we started saying, we need to go after sexual addiction, because that's the specific thing hurting sex trafficking. Well, what causes sexual addiction is trauma.
Right.
And what you're ultimately saying is,
you asked why
we
7
got to
times.
go after trauma.
Yeah.
Way more often, way more aggressively than we have been in the past, and putting more resources, whether it's in the prison, whether it's in the schools, whether it's in just young families in general, putting it in the church, having it involved in every sector. I think many times what we're doing in our society is, one side says, I've had traumatic experiences, you have to accept all my shortcomings because of it.
No.
And that's what they're saying, and that's what's wrong.
Right.
But on the defense of that, on the other extreme, is like, let's talk about what trauma really is. My parents divorced, and I'm not buying sex. And so then it becomes a lack of empathy to understanding what trauma is.
Yeah.
And I believe what we need to do is look, and we'll have more episodes about this, but ultimately look at what is trauma? What
Yeah.
causes the trauma?
Right.
And then what are the stages of overcoming that trauma?
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to get into in this little series that we're making,
Mm-hmm.
where we talk about this is what we mean by addressing the demand. It's not addressing the buyer. It's addressing what causes the buyer becoming a buyer. And it's by addressing trauma and the understanding that what is traumatic for one person. And I'm not talking about sexual abuse, the extremes. I'm not talking about some of those. I'm talking about just some of those questions. What affects someone, what affects one person to create trauma in their life. Let's just use a divorced parent, for example. May not be as extreme for another.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's not trauma.
Right.
And based upon these 8 questions. So I thank you for bringing this strategy, so that people can begin to see this is how we fight sex trafficking, by ultimately you go after all 3 sides: the buyer, the victim, the trafficker, by going after how do we treat trauma way earlier, before it becomes too rooted in, and addressing the fact that it's way easier than we believe it is. And as a society, as we've said many times, burying the trauma is only just getting it ready to explode.
Here's something interesting I heard somebody say. Trauma is not the bad things that happen to us. Trauma is how we choose to react to the bad things that happen to us.
Or in many ways, as we've learned, it's the effects in your brain
that are
caused by many things.
Right. Yeah, because that experience is so easy for a human being to turn that inward on themselves, like it's their fault and they're not good enough, and then we're down the trail of lies and where that takes us, the shame and the whole thing. In conclusion, I would like to say that the good news is, well, I'm going to start with the bad news, and you already touched on it. The bad news is, yes, we can shrink those triangles, but we can never get rid of human trafficking because it's evil.
Can't get rid of sin.
There's always going to be evil and sin in the world. You can't get rid of that. But we can make a huge dent in it.
We can diminish it.
And the good news is, I believe we have everything we need. All the puzzle pieces are like sitting here on the table. They're just not being put together right. And if we put them together right, then that big picture comes into focus, and we can make a lot of progress at that point. I'm encouraged by that.
I'm going to go ahead and end on that note. And I want to say to our viewers of the Trafficking Free America, thank you for following us and being along with us in this journey and on this series. And something to touch on that we just said, you can't get rid of sex trafficking. You can't get rid of trauma. You can't get rid of these things. You ultimately cannot get rid of sin. When I think about the calling that Jesus gave us, it wasn't to stop all sin. It's not doable. This isn't we are preparing the kingdom. Mm-hmm. We're not there yet. So we cannot expect evilness to go away. And no ruler, no person, no system, no power outside of Christ, no country will ever solve this. But the kingdom of God has been called to prepare the way to say, this is how we can heal. This is how we do not let sin affect our lives. By dealing with trauma, we are showing that this is what Christ wants to do in your life. He wants to be there and help you, and we fight through the sin together. The ultimate fight that we are called to in preparing the kingdom of God is not to create a power in a country that says we're going to stop sex trafficking. While we are called the Trafficking Free America, it's a focus on we are the American people who are probably listening to this podcast and focusing on our neighborhood, if you would, but loving our neighbor in that way. But this is not focused on having a great country that destroys sex trafficking. This is a focus on being the kingdom of God, to prepare the way for the Lord and show others the love of Christ. And it comes first by saying, hey, I'm a sinner too. How can I love on you? How can I provide resources for you to get better? How many establishments, how many people, how many churches can find ways to get more people into therapy, to get more traumatic services provided? Fight for the freedom that people can experience in Christ by overcoming sin and having the love of Christ in them more than the focus of our country. It is the kingdom of God we chase. And that is what I want us to focus on this last season of Trafficking Free America. Thank you.